Where the Tigris River makes its sharp, capricious bend north, the land changes. This is no longer the generous, sun-drenched south of Mesopotamia, the cradle of Sumer and Akkad, where the clay beneath your feet is as fertile as life itself. Here, in the north, the soil is rocky, the winds are harsher, the horizon rests on foothills, and life demands struggle. It was in this harsh land, on a high cliff overlooking the river, that the heart of future terror and glory was born. The name of this heart is Ashur. At the beginning of the second millennium BCE, Ashur was little more than a dot on the map, squeezed between giants. To the south rose the ancient kingdoms of Babylonia, heirs to 1,000-year-old wisdom. To the west and north, warlike tribes roamed and settled. Ashur itself long languished in the shadows. It was subjugated by the kings of Akkad and controlled by the rulers of the third dynasty of Ur. It was a province, an outpost, but not a center of power. Its people did not dream of conquest. Their weapon was not steel, but calculation. Their empire was not land, but roads. They were traders, brilliant, tireless traders. Ashur stood at the crossroads of worlds. From the east, from beyond the Iranian mountains came the vital resource of the era, tin. Without it, bronze, the metal of kings and armies, could not have been created. From the south, from Babylonia, came the world's finest fabrics, dyed in vibrant colors. And to the west, in the mountains of Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, lay the greatest treasure, silver and copper. The Assyrians became the bridge between these worlds. Imagine a caravan, not 10 or 20, but hundreds of donkeys, patiently trudging across the scorched earth, each laden with bales of Babylonian textiles or tin ingots, armed guards ahead and behind. The journey takes weeks. It's dangerous. It demands endurance and faith in profit. This caravan is the lifeblood of the ancient world, and Assyrian merchants were the heart that pumped it. Hundreds of kilometers from their hometown, in the heart of Anatolia, they founded their own trading colonies, which they called Karum. The most famous of these, Karum Kanesh, was an Assyrian island in a foreign sea. Here they lived by their own laws, concluded deals, held court, and wrote letters home on clay tablets. Thousands of these tablets have survived. These are not royal decrees or epic poems. They are business correspondence, full of vivid human emotion. A wife, managing a farm in Ashur, writes to her husband in Kanesh, complaining about delays in payment. Business partners argue heatedly over the quality of goods delivered. Fathers instruct their sons as they set out on their first dangerous voyage. Sell the goods profitably, buy silver, and return quickly. These clay letters breathe life. They tell the story of a people whose strength lay in enterprise, not in the sword. Their political system reflected this reality. The ruler of Ashur was not an all-powerful despot, a living god, like the pharaoh in Egypt. He bore the modest title of Ish-Shiak Ashur, meaning Viceroy of the god Ashur. The true king of the city was considered to be the god Ashur himself, a stern deity whose name both the city and the people bore. The ruler was merely its steward on earth. Important decisions were made by a council of elders and a city assembly, where the voice of wealthy merchant families carried great weight. Their world revolved not around the palace, but around the temple and the trading port. But the world was changing. Great migrations like a slow earthquake shook the entire Middle East. From the west came the Amorites, Semitic tribes, aggressive and energetic. They crushed old kingdoms and founded new dynasties. The wave of this tsunami reached Ashur. In 1813 BCE, a man rose to power in the city who would forever change its fate. His name was Shamshi-Adad Fai. He was not a native of Ashur. He was an Amorite, an outsider, the son of a chieftain who had seized the throne by force, and he brought with him a completely different concept of power. He wasn't interested in trading profits or balancing the books. He was interested in power, absolute and limitless. Shamshi-Adad disdained the old title of Viceroy. He proclaimed himself King of All, a title borne by legendary conquerors of the past, such as Sargon of Akkad. And he took action. For the first time, the Assyrian army became more than just a caravan guard, but an instrument of conquest. Shamshi-Adad subjugated all of northern Mesopotamia, creating the first Assyrian empire in history. He built fortresses, organized a spy network, and unified government. He thought in terms of empire. His state was a colossus, but it was held together solely by his iron will. He ruled for nearly 33 years, and throughout that time the region shook with his ambitions. The Assyrians, who had spent centuries learning to trade, now learned to fight and govern conquered peoples. The trading port of Ashur for the first time tried on the role of imperial capital, but after Shamshi-Adad's death, his empire, built by fire and sword, crumbled like a house of cards. His sons were unable to uphold their father's legacy. Powerful neighbors, primarily Babylon under Hammurabi, struck back. Ashur once again became a secondary city, a vassal forced to pay tribute. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. The empire experiment had failed, but something important had changed forever. It was as if a bloody battle axe had been brought into a quiet artisan's workshop. You could tuck it away in a corner, cover it with a cloth, but you could never forget its existence. For several centuries, the Assyrians returned to what they did best, trade. But the experience of Shamshi-Adad remained forever etched in their collective memory. They learned that the world could be reshaped not only by caravan routes, but also by force of arms. They tasted power over other peoples. The seed had been sown in the rocky soil of the north. Now it could only bide its time to sprout with iron and blood. The cradle of Ashur was no longer peaceful. It was preparing to unleash a predator. The heart of Assyria beat feebly. Sandwiched between two great rivers, the city of Ashur, named after its supreme god, was more a hostage to geography than its master. The dust crunching between their teeth was the dust of foreign roads. Clay tablets in the archives spoke not of victories, but of humiliating treaties and tribute. To the west, the Mitanni Empire loomed like a thundercloud, whose Hurrian kings considered the rulers of Ashur their loyal vassals, nothing more than viceroys obliged to pay tribute and supply warriors. To the south, in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, lay ancient proud Babylon, ruled by the Kassite dynasty. Its scribes and priests looked down on the northerners as crude and uncouth relatives. Assyria was a province, a shadow of foreign empires. But shadows move. And sometimes they acquire a will of their own. Around 1365 BCE, a man named Ashur-uballit I ascended the throne of Ashur. He inherited not a kingdom, but rather the right to exist. He saw the colossus of the west, Mitanni, begin to falter under the blows of a formidable new enemy, the Hittites. He sensed the wind shifting, and he did what none of his predecessors had dared. He began to act as if he were already free. In the archives of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, among letters from the great rulers of the Hittites and Babylon, his message was also found, a small clay shard of insolence. Ashur-uballit addressed the pharaoh not as a vassal, but as an equal. He called himself the great king, and the pharaoh brother. When the Babylonian king indignantly wrote to Egypt asking why these Assyrian upstarts were allowed direct contact, it was already too late. The word had been spoken. Assyria had asserted itself on the international stage. This was the first barely noticeable trace of a future shadow on the world map. Ashur-uballit acted with more than just words. He married his daughter to the Babylonian king, weaving his bloodline into the ancient dynasty. And when his grandson, the heir to the Babylonian throne, was killed in a palace coup, the Assyrian grandfather didn't write angry letters. He brought an army. He entered Babylon, took revenge on the conspirators, and placed another of his protégés on the throne. For the first time, Assyrian soldiers stood on the sacred streets of Babylon not as mercenaries or slaves, but as a force shaping destinies. The seed was thrown into the ground. Its descendants could only water it with blood. Adad-nirari-Thfain, grandson of Ashur-uballit, was a man of a different stamp. He preferred the language of steel to the language of diplomacy. He descended on the weakened Mitanni with methodical fury. City after city, fortress after fortress. He didn't simply conquer, he exterminated. His stone inscriptions reveal for the first time a new chilling policy. Having captured the enemy capital, he blinded the king and took his family and courtiers to Ashur. He salted the fields so that nothing would grow. He began the practice of mass deportations. Tens of thousands of people were driven from their homelands and resettled to other corners of the growing empire. The goal was simple and terrible: to break the will to resist, to sever the people's connection to their land, their gods, their past, to turn them into a faceless labor force for Assyrian construction projects. The shadow began to grow, and it was dark. His son, Shalmaneser I, perfected this system. He completely destroyed the remnants of Mitanni. His own records boastfully recount a victory in which he blinded 14,400 captured warriors. Think about that. He didn't kill them in the heat of battle, but afterward, in cold blood, he ordered the blinding of an entire army. This wasn't senseless cruelty. It was terror elevated to the level of state policy. It was a message to all other peoples. Resistance was futile and would only lead to a life in darkness. The Assyrian military machine was becoming more than just effective. It was becoming synonymous with terror. The apogee of this first era of ascendancy was the great-grandson of Ashur-uballit, a man with a name that sounded like a hammer striking an anvil, Tukulti-Ninurta I. He was ambitious, ruthless, and believed that the god Ashur had chosen him for world dominion. His gaze was turned south, toward Babylon. The eternal rival, the cultural center of the world, the city of Marduk himself. In 1225 BCE, Tukulti-Ninurta did the unthinkable. He stormed Babylon. He didn't simply install a puppet on the throne like his great-grandfather. He crushed it. Assyrian soldiers stormed the city, which had been their unattainable ideal for centuries. They plundered temples, stripped gold from the walls, smashed statues, and Tukulti-Ninurta committed the ultimate sacrilege. He entered the main temple, Isagila, and carried off the statue of Babylon's supreme god, Marduk. For the people of that era, this was more than just the theft of an idol. It meant that the god had abandoned his city, that Babylon had lost divine protection, that Ashur himself was now the supreme god, and his earthly viceroy, the king of Assyria, was the ruler of all Mesopotamia. A shadow fell upon Babylon. Tukulti-Ninurta proclaimed himself king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four cardinal directions. Intoxicated with triumph, he built a new capital for himself, naming it Kartokulti-Ninurta. He erected palaces and surrounded himself with unimaginable luxury. He reached a pinnacle his ancestors could not have dreamed of, but the shadow he cast was so long that it eventually consumed him. His cruelty and arrogance turned everyone against him, including his own nobles. Even in Assyria, his actions with Marduk were considered sacrilege, a violation of divine order. Locked away in his new capital, he grew increasingly suspicious and isolated, and the end was inevitable. His own sons led a conspiracy. They besieged their father in his own palace. The man who had conquered Babylon was murdered by his own children in the city that should have been a monument to his eternal glory. The first shadow of Assyria, having reached its peak, retreated for a moment. But the lesson had been learned. The methods had been tested. Cruelty, efficiency, terror, and faith in one's divine destiny. None of this had disappeared. It merely lurked in the heart of Ashur, biding its time to descend upon the world once again with unprecedented force. For nearly 2 centuries, Assyria was a phantom, a shadow of its former glory. The great kings of the past, conquerors of Babylon and terrors of the Hittites, were reduced to lines of cuneiform on broken tablets buried beneath the hills of northern Mesopotamia. Their empire, once stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the banks of the Euphrates, had shrunk to a patch of land around the ancient cities of Ashur and Nineveh. Aramaic tribes, like desert sand, seeped across the borders, settling in the fields, cutting off trade routes. Assyrian kings paid them tribute. They hid behind the walls of their cities while the world they once built crumbled to dust. The voice of Assyria faded. But at the heart of this decline, at the very core of the weakened kingdom, beat an indomitable heart. It beat in time with the hammers in the armories of Ashur. It stirred blood that remembered the taste of world domination. And at the beginning of the 9th century BC, this heart began to beat with renewed, furious vigor. It all began not with thunder and fire, but with methodical, ruthless work. King after king, Adad-nirari II, then Tukulti-Ninurta II, began to stitch together the tattered pieces of their land. They didn't make sweeping conquests. They reclaimed what was theirs. Village by village, field by field, they pushed back the Arameans, reclaiming lands the Assyrians already considered their birthright. It was the slow, bloody work of mending the nation's broken backbone. They strengthened the army, honed it, transforming it from a militia into a professional force. Chariots were re-oiled, spearheads forged from new, stronger iron. Assyria was learning to fight anew. And then, in 883 BC, a man ascended the throne who wasn't just a king. He was a natural disaster. His name was Ashurnasirpal II. He didn't simply rule. He erupted upon the world around him like an avalanche of fire and steel. For him, diplomacy didn't exist. There were only 2 states, total submission or total annihilation. His chronicles, carved on the stone slabs of his palace, are not dry reports. They are hymns of cruelty, methodical instructions for instilling terror. He didn't simply conquer, he erased the memory of the disobedient. The walls of cities witnessed their defenders flayed alive. Their screams became part of the foundation of a new power. He impaled enemies along the roads leading to their ruined homes, a grisly, silent lesson for all who dared doubt. He built pyramids of heads. He burned children in flames. This was not senseless barbarism. It was a calculated state policy of terror. News of his approach traveled faster than his chariots, and many cities opened their gates, begging for mercy rather than suffer his wrath. Having amassed countless treasures, Ashurnasirpal decided the old capitals were too cramped for his new empire. He moved his court to the abandoned city of Kolhu, known as Nimrud. Here, he launched a construction project unseen since the time of the legendary kings of Akkad. Tens of thousands of captives from all corners of the known world labored under the scorching sun. They erected walls so thick a chariot could pass over them. They built a palace that was both a wonder and a nightmare. Its entrances were guarded by gigantic winged bulls with human heads, carved from single blocks of alabaster, silent guardians of imperial might. The walls inside were covered with kilometers of reliefs telling the story of the king. Here he is, hunting, slaying lions. Here he is feasting, and here he is crushing enemies, trampling them underfoot, accepting tribute from trembling rulers. Any ambassador entering these halls read the story of his own possible future. It was propaganda carved in stone. In 879 BC, to celebrate the completion of the construction, Ashurnasirpal held a feast that has gone down in history. He invited nearly 70,000 people. Chronicles meticulously list what was eaten and drunk: 14,000 sheep, 1,000 oxen, 10,000 skins of wine, 10,000 jugs of beer. For 10 days, the entire elite of the empire and ambassadors from the conquered peoples feasted in the new capital, contemplating the greatness of the king who had raised Assyria from its ashes. His son, Shalmaneser III, inherited not just the throne, but a well-oiled military machine and a doctrine of continuous warfare. Almost every year of his 35-year reign, he personally led an army on campaign. If his father was a raging conflagration, his son became an inexorable glacier, slowly but surely spreading in all directions. He moved westward, toward the Mediterranean, subjugating Phoenician cities and demanding tribute in cedar and silver. He fought in the mountains of Urartu, where the enemy was stubborn and cruel, but his greatest test came in Syria. There, near the city of Karkar in 853 BCE, a coalition of 12 kings opposed him. The king of Damascus, the king of Hamath, and even Ahab, the king of Israel, fielded 2,000 chariots, a formidable force at the time. Shalmaneser boasted in his inscriptions of a crushing victory. He wrote that he had filled the Orontes River with the bodies of his enemies, that their blood had stained the valley red. But the truth, as always, was more complex. He failed to take Damascus. He was forced to return to Syria again and again and again. The Great Coalition halted the Assyrian steamroller, if only briefly. It showed that the world was not going to give up without a fight. Nevertheless, by the end of Shalmaneser III's reign, Assyria had become the undisputed hegemon of the Middle East. From Babylonia in the south to the Taurus Mountains in the north, from the Iranian plateau in the east to the Syrian coast in the west, everyone paid tribute or lived in fear of the annual Assyrian army. What Ashurnasirpal had begun as a series of marauding raids had evolved into a system of imperial control based on iron, blood, and the unquestionable will of the king. The foundation had been laid, and on this foundation, his descendants would erect the most powerful and most ruthless empire the ancient world had ever seen. Imagine dust. Not just road dust, but a vast, suffocating cloud born of 100,000 sandals, 1,000 hooves, and the creaking of countless wheels. This cloud is a harbinger. It creeps across the sun-baked valley long before you hear the first sound. And then, through the haze, the geometry of horror emerges. Perfect ranks of spearmen, their bronze helmets casting merciless glare, cavalry wedge-shaped formations, rider and horse moving as one, and the war chariots thundering in the vanguard. swift platforms of death. This is not an army in the conventional sense. This is not a militia assembled for a single season. Before you is the first professional, permanent military machine in human history, a mechanism honed by the genius of King Tiglath-Pileser III and perfected by his successors. Before him, armies had come and gone. After him, war forever changed its face. The Assyrians were the first to understand. An empire forged in iron must be supported by iron. The entire power of the state, its entire economy and ideology were subordinated to a single goal: expansion. Every man was a potential soldier. Every captured resource was fuel for a new campaign. They created what we would today call branches of the military and honed their interaction to a deadly automatism. Here comes the infantry. In the front ranks are heavily armored warriors, a wall of shields and spears. Behind them are archers, capable of raining down a cloud of arrows on the enemy with such density that, as chroniclers write, it blotted out the sun. They fired in volleys, on command, turning the battlefield into a zone of total destruction. But the true Assyrian innovation was the cavalry. Not just horsemen with javelins, but a true striking force. For the first time in history, mounted archers learned to fire at full gallop, showering the enemy with arrows and instantly retreating, exhausting and disrupting their ranks. They were the eyes and the sting of the army. And chariots, those ancient tanks, now carried not 2 but 3 or even 4 warriors, turning into mobile fortresses that could smash through any defense. But brute force was only one cog in this machine. Another, no less important, was engineering. The Assyrians were geniuses of siegecraft. For them, no city was impregnable. Any wall was merely a temporary obstacle, a problem requiring a technical solution. If the city stood on a plain, siege towers were brought up to its walls. Wooden monsters covered in wet oxhide to prevent them from being set on fire slowly crawled toward the walls. From their summits, archers cleared the fortifications of defenders, while below, another monster, the battering ram, began its monotonous, crushing work. A massive log with a bronze tip swung by dozens of soldiers struck a single point, again and again and again. The sound of these blows, carried for kilometers, was a psychological weapon, destroying not only stone but also the will to resist. If a city stood on a hill, the Assyrians didn't retreat. They built their own hill. Thousands of prisoners and soldiers hauled earth, stones, and logs, constructing a gigantic siege embankment, a ramp that slowly, day after day, crept toward the top of the enemy wall. Imagine the defenders of Lachish in 701 BCE. Every day they awoke to find the ground beneath their feet rising, that the enemy was closer, that their world was shrinking. This methodical, relentless work of engineers was more terrifying than any furious attack. And that's not all. Under cover of night, sappers crept to the foundations of the walls. They dug tunnels, reinforced them with wooden supports, and then set them on fire. The vaults collapsed and a breach suddenly appeared in the wall. The Assyrians were the first in history to wage war on all levels, above ground, on the ground, and underground. This machine required fuel, and it consumed it in incredible quantities. The logistics of the Assyrian army were a marvel of organization. Special units paved roads, built bridges, and established supply and weapons depots along the entire route of the army. The empire was permeated with a communications network that allowed for the rapid movement of forces and the supply of everything they needed, thousands of kilometers from home. But Assyria's most terrifying weapon wasn't made of iron or wood. It was forged from words and images. It was a psychology of total terror. Assyrian kings didn't just conquer, they turned their victories into blood-curdling spectacles. Palace reliefs aren't art as we understand it. Their state propaganda carved in stone. We see more than just battle scenes. We see what happens afterward. Captives are impaled along the road leading to the sacked city. Living rulers are flayed. Mountains of severed heads are piled at the city gates. Scribes meticulously count the spoils, people, livestock, and gold. This wasn't senseless cruelty. It was calculation, cold and pragmatic. Rumors of this ruthlessness flew ahead of the army. King Sennacherib, having besieged Jerusalem, didn't boast about the number of those killed. In his annals he wrote, "And Hezekiah, king of Judah, I confined in his capital like a bird in a cage." The threat was clear without words. Resistance meant total annihilation. Submission was a chance to survive. Many cities surrendered without a fight, simply seeing that cloud of dust on the horizon. Those who survived faced the final phase of the machine's work, deportation. The Assyrians were the first to use mass migrations as a tool of state policy. They didn't simply carry people off into slavery. They uprooted entire nations. Tens, hundreds of thousands of people were driven from their lands and resettled to the other end of the empire. In this way, they broke the will to resist, mixed the population, and destroyed national identity. Skilled artisans were sent to build new capitals, Nineveh and Dur-Sharrukin. Peasants were sent to settle new lands. From the ashes of conquered kingdoms, from the ruins of foreign lives, Assyria built its greatness. It was a system, ruthless, efficient, all-consuming, a machine of absolute war that never stopped after victory on the battlefield. It crushed cities, peoples, and cultures, subjugating them to a single imperial will. And the hum of this machine became the dominant sound of the ancient Near East for many centuries. The sound of fear, order, and inescapable fate. The Assyrian war machine ran on two fuels. The first was iron, the second was fear, and this second resource was far more valuable, far more destructive. We call it the doctrine of terror, but for the Assyrians it was more. It was a state policy, honed to perfection, refined into art, and etched in stone for eternity. Terror wasn't a side effect of war. It was its primary weapon. It didn't start with them, but they were the ones who systematized cruelty. In the 9th century BC, King Ashurnasirpal II ascended the throne, and from that moment on, whispers of Assyrian cruelty became a deafening cry, echoing throughout the Middle East. This king didn't just conquer, he set precedents. He left messages written not in ink on papyrus, but in blood and pain on the very bodies of his enemies. Imagine a city that dared to rebel. Assyrian siege engines, like armored monsters from the underworld, crush its walls. The city has fallen. Now begins the most important thing, the lesson. In his official annals, carved in stone, Ashurnasirpal describes what happened next, without a shadow of a doubt and with cold pride. "I erected a pillar at the city gate," he writes, "and flayed all the leaders who had rebelled and covered the pillar with their skins." This is not a metaphor. Enter in your mind's eye the palace he rebuilt in Kalhu. The walls are not silent. They scream with stories carved into alabaster reliefs. Here are Assyrian soldiers flaying a captive. Here are rows of stakes stretching to the horizon, and on each one a man impaled alive. Here are mountains of severed heads, which soldiers carefully stack into pyramids while scribes keep count. This was not hidden. On the contrary, it was on display. The reliefs in the palace were seen by all ambassadors, all tributaries, all petitioners. It was visual propaganda, a visualization of state power, a warning carved in stone. Resistance is futile. The consequences are unbearable. Fear ran ahead of the army. Stories of the fate of rebellious cities were passed from mouth to mouth, growing increasingly horrific. Merchants, travelers, refugees, all were unwitting heralds of Assyrian propaganda. By the time Assyrian standards appeared at the walls of another city, its defenders and residents were already paralyzed with terror. Many cities surrendered without a fight, preferring to pay any tribute rather than face public execution. Terror saved time, resources, and the lives of Assyrian soldiers. It was effective, but terror had another face, colder and more systematic. Its name was mass deportation. This practice was brought to chilling perfection by Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE. The goal was not simply to punish, but to destroy the very possibility of future rebellion, to uproot the people. Tens, hundreds of thousands of people were driven from their lands and resettled on the other side of the vast empire. The elite, artisans, scribes, warriors, priests were taken first. They were dispersed among other peoples, and in their place were brought similar exiles from other conquered lands. It was an act of cultural genocide. People lost everything: their temples, ancestral graves, their familiar landscape, their social connections. They became strangers in a strange land, surrounded by other strangers, speaking other languages and praying to other gods. Any thought of organized resistance died before it was born. It was this policy that led to the disappearance of dozens of peoples, including 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, whose traces are lost in history after the Assyrian conquest. It was an attempt to create a new generic imperial subject, devoid of a past and completely dependent on the will of the Assyrian king. The pinnacle of this doctrine was King Sennacherib's campaign against Judea in 701 BCE. King Hezekiah of Judea rebelled, and Sennacherib came to teach him a lesson. The main blow was struck at the city of Lachish, Judea's second most important stronghold. We know what happened there in minute detail, not only from the Bible, but also thanks to Sennacherib himself. In his palace in Nineveh, he dedicated an entire hall to reliefs depicting in detail the siege and capture of Lachish. It's a storyboard of horror. Here, Assyrian soldiers build a gigantic siege ramp from earth and stone, hauling battering rams up to the walls. Here, archers on both sides rain arrows down on each other. Here, Assyrians storm the walls using ladders. And here's the next shot. The city is taken. Prisoners are led out in processions. Some are executed on the spot. Others are impaled right under the walls of their hometown. Still others, the most noble, are forced to crawl on their knees to the throne of Sennacherib, who personally oversees the triumph. Scribes keep track of the spoils and the captives. Families are separated forever. According to Sennacherib's own inscriptions, 200,150 people were exiled from Judea. Sennacherib failed to take Jerusalem itself, but he boasted in his annals that he locked King Hezekiah in his capital like a bird in a cage. Lesson learned. Terror worked again. Thus, the Assyrian Empire was held together not only by force of arms, but also by the power of its reputation. Every captive carved into stone, every flayed skin, every deported family were bricks in the wall that separated the empire from chaos. This was cruelty elevated to the rank of statesmanship, calculated, methodical, and terrifyingly logical in its goal, to break the will to resist not on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of millions of people who had never even laid eyes on an Assyrian soldier. Terror wasn't just a method, it was a message. And the message was very simple: submit or perish. King of the universe, not just a title, it was a proclamation of divine order, carved in stone and clay, an order in which the god Ashur was the center of the universe, and his will was embodied in one man, the king of Assyria. All the land that lay beyond the empire's borders wasn't just foreign, it was wrong, chaotic, and it needed to be corrected. Every Assyrian campaign began not in the throne room, but in the temple. The king, dressed in ceremonial attire, consulted the gods. The priests divined from the livers of sacrificial sheep, looked for omens in the flight of birds, and in the shape of oil stains on the water. And the answer was always the same. Ashur thirsted for new lands. Ashur demanded that his order be enforced by fire and sword. The king was not a conqueror in our understanding. He was a high priest fulfilling a sacred duty. He was the instrument of his god. And this weapon was honed to perfection. The Assyrian military machine, honed over centuries of ceaseless warfare, was unmatched. Its heart was the ironclad infantry, marching in step to the dull beat of drums. Its fists were chariots, rushing toward the enemy with a screech and a roar. But its true genius was revealed at the walls of foreign cities. No one before the Assyrians had transformed siegecraft into a precise, merciless science. Decades of engineering refined their craft, constructing gigantic siege ramps of earth and wood, hauling battering rams, covered in damp leather like armored monsters, up to the walls. Hundreds of archers from siege towers rained arrows down on the defenders, keeping them pinned down. And underground sappers like giant moles dug tunnels to undermine the wall's foundations. The city, trapped under the Assyrian siege, was doomed. It was only a matter of time. And when the walls crumbled, that which constituted the essence of Assyrian power began, methodical, calculated terror. This wasn't the blind fury of victors, it was state policy, an object lesson for anyone who dared resist. The royal scribes recorded the results with dispassionate precision on clay tablets. The skins of their nobles I flayed and hung on the city walls, the king dictated. Some of them had their eyes gouged out, others had their noses, ears, and fingers chopped off. From their heads I built a tower before the city. Images of this triumphant horror covered the walls of palaces in Nineveh and Nimrud. Brightly colored reliefs depicted endless lines of captives. Men, women, and children, driven from their lands, marched under the escort of Assyrian soldiers. They were not being led into slavery in the traditional sense. They were being taken to a new place of residence. Mass deportations were the cornerstone of the empire. A Phoenician artisan might be resettled in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, an Aramaic peasant in the Tigris Valley. Tens, hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted and mixed in a gigantic imperial cauldron. Thus, old ties were broken, the very memory of independence destroyed. Peoples were not allowed to unite. They were transformed into an atomized mass, a labor force for the king's grandiose construction projects. From their labor, new cities, canals, and ziggurats arose. From their taxes, a new army for new conquests. Returning from a campaign, the king performed the main ritual. He brought the captured spoils and statues of foreign gods to the feet of Ashur. This wasn't just a trophy. It was proof. Proof that Ashur was more powerful than any other god, that his order was the only true one. And then the king ordered his scribes to record his deeds for eternity. On clay prisms laid in the foundations of temples, the official history was inscribed in cramped cuneiform. I, Ashurbanipal, the great king, the mighty king, king of the universe, king of Assyria. Then followed a complete list of conquered cities, executed rulers, and exiled peoples. Every word, every line was an affirmation of his authority bestowed upon him by God. The title King of the Universe was no empty boast. For the Assyrian ruler and his subjects, the universe was the empire. Everything beyond its borders was merely temporary chaos awaiting order. The world was a stage on which a single drama was played out, the will of the god Ashur, embodied in his earthly viceroy, and every hammer strike on the chisel, carving another chronicle of victories on the palace walls, was a blow sealing this truth for eternity, or so they believed. On the southern border of the Assyrian world, where the Fertile Crescent dried up into a merciless desert, lay a land that was ancient even when Ashur was just a mud brick city. Egypt. The Nile Valley was more than just a target for conquest. It was a challenge. A 1,000-year-old civilization ruled by living gods had become a thorn in the empire's side, a constant source of unrest and rebellion in the Levant. The pharaohs of the 25th Kushite dynasty were unwilling to accept the shadow of Assyria that had fallen over the entire Middle East, and the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, son of Sennacherib, decided to pluck this thorn out by the roots. The first attempt, undertaken around 674 BC, foundered in the sands of Sinai. The invincible Assyrian army, seasoned in dozens of campaigns, faced an enemy unbreakable by iron, the desert itself. Pharaoh Taharka celebrated victory. For Esarhaddon, this was more than just a defeat. It was a personal insult. He returned 3 years later, in 671 BC. This time, he was ready. The Assyrians brought with them not only siege engines and thousands of warriors in conical helmets, they also led camels laden with water skins, the key to overcoming the scorching barrier. Taharka's army awaited them at the Egyptian border. Imagine this battle. The Iron Age bursts into a world of bronze and stone. Light Egyptian chariots designed for maneuvering on level ground clash with heavy Assyrian war carts, veritable mobile fortresses. Nubian archers, the best in the world, rain down clouds of arrows on the enemy, but they are shattered by a solid wall of shields. The Assyrian infantry, disciplined and ruthless, advances at a steady pace, to the pounding of drums and the blaring of war horns. This was more than just a battle. It was a clash of two military philosophies, two worlds. In 15 days, the Assyrians fought their way from the border to the capital, all the way to Memphis. The city fell. Esarhaddon entered the sacred halls of the pharaohs, not as a guest, but as a host. Taharka fled south to his Nubian fiefdom, abandoning his family. Esarhaddon captured his wife, his sons and daughters, and his entire court. To commemorate his triumph, the king ordered a victory stele carved. On it he, a giant in a royal tiara, holds two captives in chains. One of them is Prince Ushanahuru, the son of that very Taharka, kneeling, humiliated. The message was clear and harsh. Even the sons of the gods could wear Assyrian shackles. Egypt was conquered. Lower Egypt became a province of Assyria, but the Nile does not tolerate foreign masters. Just as Esarhaddon set off for home, Taharka returned. The rebellion flared up with renewed vigor. The aging Assyrian king, enraged by the treachery, once again gathered his army and marched to Egypt to end the Kushite threat once and for all. But he never made it. Death overtook him en route. The burden of the Egyptian problem fell on the shoulders of his son, Ashurbanipal. Educated, refined, and the creator of the greatest library of antiquity, Ashurbanipal possessed the cold ruthlessness of his grandfather and the strategic acumen of his father. he sent an army south. Taharqa was again defeated and again fled. Ashurbanipal, unlike his father, placed his trust in local Egyptian princes, installing them as vassals to rule. He hoped the Egyptians would prefer their own to foreigners from the south. He miscalculated. As soon as the Assyrian garrisons relaxed their grip, the vassal rulers of the Delta began secret negotiations with Taharqa. The plot was uncovered. Ashurbanipal responded swiftly and mercilessly. The rebellious cities were razed, the ringleaders executed, but he spared the life of one of them, Necho, the ruler of Sais, and even restored him to power. It was a cunning move. Ashurbanipal demonstrated that he could not only punish but also pardon, turning an enemy into a beholden ally. Soon Taharqa died. The war seemed over, but his nephew Tanuatamun proved no less ambitious. He marched north from Nubia, and Egypt, weary of the Assyrians, greeted him as a liberator. He captured Memphis and killed that same Necho, the Assyrian vassal. It was an open challenge, thrown straight into the face of the Assyrian ruler. Ashurbanipal's response went down in the annals of history as an act of unprecedented fury. This time, the target wasn't just Memphis. The target was the soul of Egypt. The Assyrian army marched south up the Nile to the city the Greeks would later call Thebes, and the Egyptians called Wasit. It was the sacred city of the god Amun-Ra, a religious capital, a treasury filled with gifts from the pharaohs for 1,500 years. In 663 BC, the Assyrians approached its walls. Tanuatamen fled without a fight. Ashurbanipal's soldiers stormed the city of 100 gates. What followed was no simple plunder. It was ritual destruction. They broke into temples, stripped gold from gates and walls. They shattered statues of gods. 2 enormous obelisks of electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, weighing 2,500 talents, were broken up and taken to Nineveh. Tens of thousands of residents, from priests to artisans, were carried off into slavery. Ashurbanipal boasted in his chronicles, "I took possession of the entire city. Silver, gold, precious stones, colorful garments, linen, large horses, people, men and women. 2 tall obelisks. I removed from their places and took them to Assyria. I carried off countless heavy spoils from Thebes." The fall of Thebes shocked the ancient world. The news spread from Libya to Babylon. Even the Bible, in the book of the prophet Nahum, recalls the fate of No-Ammon, the Hebrew name for Thebes, as a warning to Nineveh itself. Assyria demonstrated that nothing is sacred, that its wrath could wipe out not just a city, but the very memory of it. The victory was complete, final. The Kushite dynasty left Egypt forever. The Assyrian Empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from the mountains of Iran to the cataracts of the Nile. But in the rumble of the fall of Thebes, echoes of future collapse were already heard. An empire built on such absolute terror bred not submission, but only hatred, biding its time to burst forth. Egypt was broken, but not conquered, and the world long remembered the wounds inflicted on the sacred land of the pharaohs. We're accustomed to imagining Assyria through the roar of siege engines and the cries of conquered cities. We see a king seated on a throne of skulls, his scribes meticulously counting the severed hands of his enemies. Iron, blood, and fear. These were the 3 pillars on which this power seemed to rest. But these are only one side of the coin, merely the empire's muscles. And every great empire must have a mind. And Assyria's mind was carved in clay. To rule the world from Egypt to the mountains of Iran, the most powerful armies and the most brutal governors are not enough. An empire is more than just conquered land. An empire is information. It is knowledge of when to sow grain in the Euphrates Valley and when to collect tribute from Phoenician merchants. It is lists of the gods of conquered peoples so that they know whom to invoke and whom to appease. It is precise maps of the stars so that they can predict river floods, eclipses, and the will of the gods themselves. Without this knowledge, any military machine, even the mightiest, is nothing more than a blind giant doomed to collapse under its own weight. And the Assyrians, pragmatists to the core, understood this better than anyone. Their weapon was not only the sword but also the stylus, a sharpened reed. Their battlefield was not only the fortress wall but also the damp clay tablet. In every major city, in every administrative center, thousands of styluses creaked. Scribes trained for years in the complex art of cuneiform compiled reports on grain deliveries, troop movements, and canal construction. They copied royal decrees, which couriers carried to every corner of the vast empire. This bureaucratic network, woven from clay and words, was the true skeleton of the empire, far more solid than the walls of its capitals. But one man saw in the clay tablets something more than just a tool of power. His name was Ashurbanipal. He ascended the throne in the 7th century BCE at the height of Assyrian power. He was a ruthless warrior, like his ancestors. In his bas-reliefs, he hunts lions, crushes enemies, and feasts with his foot on the head of a fallen Elamite king. He is the lion of Assyria, the embodiment of its fury and strength, but he was also something no ruler before him had ever been. He was an intellectual, an archivist, a collector of wisdom. Ashurbanipal issued an order unprecedented in its audacity and scale. He ordered his agents, scribes, and governors to collect all the knowledge accumulated by humanity in his capital, Nineveh. Not just reports and decrees, but everything: ancient Sumerian myths, Babylonian astronomical treatises, medical manuals, collections of spells and prophecies, epic poems, dictionaries. The king's agents scoured Mesopotamia, searching temple libraries and scribal schools for ancient texts. They didn't simply take them. They demanded that exact copies be made. If the owners refused, the tablets were confiscated by force. It was intellectual plunder on an imperial scale. Imagine this process. Scribes in distant Uruk or Babylon bending over millennia-old crumbling originals, painstakingly, sign by sign, transfer the lines onto fresh tablets of Nineveh clay. Each copy is certified with a colophon, a special note, copied and verified according to the old original. Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the Universe, King of Assyria. Why did he need this? It wasn't just a scholar's curiosity. Ashurbanipal believed that knowledge was the highest form of power. Power not only over people, but over fate itself. By collecting all the texts of prophecies and omens, he gained the ability to peer into the future, to discern the will of the gods before his enemies. By collecting all the medical texts, he could cure diseases and control life and death. By collecting all the myths and epics, including the great epic of Gilgamesh, he became the custodian of the cultural memory of all of Mesopotamia, placing Assyria at the center of the civilized world. He wanted to concentrate in his hands not gold or slaves, but the entire intellectual capital of the ancient world. Thus, in Nineveh, in his magnificent palace, a miracle was born, the first systematic, comprehensive library in human history. Tens of thousands of tablets, carefully arranged on wooden shelves in special rooms. Each series had its own catalog, each tablet its own page number, so that a scribe could unerringly find the rest of the text. More than 25,000 clay books were stored here. This was the brain of the empire, its collective memory, and its instrument of foresight. But history is full of cruel irony. In 612 BC, hordes of Medes and Babylonians breached the walls of Nineveh. The hated city, which had terrorized its neighbors for centuries, was consigned to fire and sword. Ashurbanipal's palace was ablaze. The library's wooden shelves collapsed, turning to ashes. It seemed the greatest collection of ancient knowledge had perished forever, along with the empire that had birthed it. But the opposite happened. The fire, intended to destroy, performed a miracle of preservation. Clay tablets, previously merely sun-dried, were fired in this hellish flame, transforming into durable, almost eternal ceramics. The fire that destroyed the palace made its library immortal. And when, 2,500 years later, archaeologists excavated the hills where Nineveh once stood, they found them. Tens of thousands of charred fragments. The mind of Assyria, buried beneath the ruins, had outlived both its creators and its destroyers. The Lion Empire has long since crumbled to dust, its armies vanished, its cities razed to the ground. But the words inscribed in clay by the Scholar King's command still resonate today, telling us stories of gods, heroes, and how one of history's most brutal civilizations desperately sought to understand and subjugate the universe not only by force of arms, but also by the power of reason. Imagine greatness, not just power, but absolute dominance. In the mid-7th century BCE, Assyria was more than just an empire, it was a world. Its borders stretched from the mountains of Iran to the scorching sands of Egypt. Its armies knew no defeat. Its king, Ashurbanipal, ruled from Nineveh, a city whose walls seemed built for eternity. He was more than just a conqueror. He was a bibliophile who assembled in his palace the greatest library of the ancient world. Tens of thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform contained epics, spells, astronomical calculations, laws, and medical treatises. Wisdom and cruelty in one person, power and culture in one state, it seemed this construct had reached its apogee, its unshakable perfection. But the deepest cracks don't run along borders, they run through families. Ashurbanipal's father, King Esarhaddon, trying to prevent a future civil war, made a fatal mistake. He divided power. He bequeathed the throne of Assyria, the heart of the empire, to his eldest son, Ashurbanipal, and to his youngest, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, he gave Babylon. Ancient, proud, and eternally rebellious Babylon. Formerly, Shamash-Shum-Ukin was a vassal, equal to his brother by blood, but subordinate in status. 2 kings, 1 empire. It was a formula for disaster. For 16 years, the brothers ruled in shaky peace. Ashurbanipal sent gifts to Babylon. Shamash-Shum-Ukin sent reports to Nineveh. But beneath the thin gilding of court etiquette, the poison of mistrust simmered. The Babylonian nobility whispered in their king's ear, "Why are you a servant? You are a descendant of great kings, not a viceroy." The Aramaic and Chaldean tribes, conquered but not broken, saw their chance in the Babylonian ruler, and Shamash-Shum-Ukin began to weave a web of conspiracy. Secret messengers rushed to Elam, Assyria's longtime enemies. They traveled to the Arab sheikhs in the desert, to the rulers on the Phoenician coast. The message was simple: rise with me. Together we will throw off the yoke of Nineveh. In 652 BCE, the rift became a chasm. Shamash-Shum-Ukin closed the gates of Babylon and declared himself an independent king. Rebellions broke out across the empire. This was more than just a rebellion. It was a blow to the heart. Brother turned against brother. Ashurbanipal was furious, not the rage of a barbarian, but the cold, calculating rage of a surgeon about to remove a tumor. He marched his legions south, the invincible Assyrian military machine honed by centuries of conquest. The siege of Babylon had begun. It was no quick battle. It was an agony that lasted for 3 long years. The Assyrians erected a colossal rampart around the city, cutting it off from the outside world. They built siege towers lined with wet hides to protect them from incendiary arrows. Battering rams, like gigantic armored beasts, pounded the brick walls day and night. But Babylon held firm. Its defenders fought with the desperation of the doomed. Hell erupted within the city. Food supplies ran dry. The chronicles left by the Assyrians record the horror dispassionately. The price of a handful of grain became equal to the price of silver. People ate the leather from their sandals. They ate the grass that grew between the paving stones. And then they began to eat each other. Assyrian cuneiform texts put it bluntly, without metaphor. They ate the flesh of their sons and daughters because of hunger. A great city, a center of learning and culture, was transformed into a mass grave where the living envied the dead. Shamash Shum-Ukin saw his dream of freedom turning into a nightmare. His allies were defeated one after another by the Assyrian armies. The Elamites were betrayed. The Arabs were scattered in the desert. There was no help to be had. Assyrian warriors were already breaching the walls. The end was near. And then, in 648 BCE, as Assyrian soldiers were already storming the streets, drenching them in blood, Shamash Shum-Ukin made his final royal decision. He would not surrender. He did not want to be paraded in chains through the streets of Nineveh for the amusement of the crowd. He ordered a huge bonfire lit in his palace, and, along with his family and his entourage, he threw himself into the flames. The blazing palace became his funeral pyre and mausoleum. The royal purple was reduced to ashes. Ashurbanipal was victorious. He cruelly punished the rebels. The tongues of those who spoke against Assyria were torn out. The bodies of the ringleaders were thrown to the dogs. Babylon was cleansed and given a new puppet ruler. The empire was united once again, but this victory smelled of ashes. For 3 years, the finest Assyrian troops were tied down by a single siege. The treasury was devastated. The provinces were devastated by war. Tens of thousands of warriors, the cream of the Assyrian army, perished before the walls of Babylon or in countless punitive expeditions. Ashurbanipal saved the empire, but mortally wounded it. He repaired the rift, but to do so, he had to drain the state of its vitality. The silence that fell over the ruins of Babylon was deafening. It was the silence of exhaustion. The great colossus still stood, casting a shadow over half the known world, but within it had been scorched to the ground by fratricidal war, and to the north in the mountains new enemies were already gathering. The Medes, the Scythians. They saw this weakness. They bided their time. Assyria had won the battle for its existence, but lost the war against time. The last great king of Nineveh, without knowing it, had written the prologue to its inevitable demise. An empire built on blood and fear rests on one simple rule: obey or die. But what if the rebellion isn't led by a foreign king, but by your own brother? What if the stab in the back comes from someone who shared your childhood? In 669 BC, the dying king Esarhaddon left behind not just an empire, but a ticking mechanism of disaster. He divided his inheritance between his 2 sons. To the younger, Ashurbanipal, he gave everything: the throne of Assyria, the title of King of Kings, and rule over the world. To the elder, Shamash Shum-Ukin, he inherited Babylon, It was not an equal division. It was a consolation prize. Babylon, the ancient, proud, sacred city, the cradle of civilization, reduced to the status of a vassal kingdom, and its king to the position of viceroy, obliged to answer to his younger brother in Nineveh. One crown was forged of imperial steel and boundless power, the other of pure gold and ancient glory, but under the iron heel of Assyria. For 16 years the brothers played their roles. Ashurbanipal conquered Egypt and ravaged Elam, his cuneiform reports full of triumph and cruelty. Shamash-Shum-Ukin ruled in Babylon. He restored temples, pacified the priests, and received ambassadors. Outwardly, all seemed well. Polite letters flew between Nineveh and Babylon, full of fraternal greetings and formal assurances of loyalty. But behind every line written on a clay tablet, tension lurked. Ashurbanipal demanded reports. His spies and governors in the Babylonian cities reported on his elder brother's every move. For the king of Assyria, Shamash-Shum-Ukin was not an equal monarch, but merely the most senior of his servants. And for Shamash-Shum-Ukin, every such dispatch, every order from Nineveh was a drop of poison in the cup of his pride. He was the firstborn. He was the king of a city that had witnessed the birth of laws and astronomy when the Assyrians were just an obscure tribe in the north. And he was tired of bowing. Secret diplomacy began in the shadow of ziggurats and the silence of caravan routes. Shamash-Shum-Ukin's messengers carried his messages to every corner of the Fertile Crescent. He addressed all who hated the Assyrian yoke. He addressed the Elamites, Nineveh's eternal enemies, promising them revenge for decades of humiliation. He addressed the Chaldean tribes in the south, in the marshy lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, whose freedom the Assyrians constantly tried to trample. He addressed the nomadic Aramaic and Arab chieftains, whose caravans suffered from the exactions of Assyrian governors. He addressed the Phoenician cities on the coast which paid tribute in cedar and silver. The message was simple: rise with me, and together we will shatter the iron cage. The empire is bursting at the seams. One powerful coordinated blow and it will collapse. And so, in 652 BC, the mask was dropped. Shamash-Shum-Ukin closed the gates of Babylon. He stopped sending tribute. He publicly proclaimed himself not just the king of Babylon, but the true king of Assyria, accusing his brother of usurpation. The great revolt began. Fire engulfed all of Mesopotamia. The cities of the south, Uruk, Sippar, Borsippa, swore allegiance to Babylon. The Elamite army marched to the rescue. It seemed Shamash-Shum-Ukin's plan had worked. Ashurbanipal's reaction was like a lightning strike. His surviving clay cylinders exude not just anger, but the fury of a betrayed man. He calls his brother treacherous, forgetting goodness, an instrument of evil demons. For him, this was more than just war. It was sacrilege. The Assyrian military machine, honed by centuries of continuous conquest, turned south. The siege of Babylon had begun. It was more than just a battle for the city. It was a duel between two worlds, two brothers. The Assyrian army, a ruthless machine of siege towers, battering rams, and battle-hardened veterans, had closed its circle around the greatest city of antiquity. But the walls of Babylon were legendary. They seemed impregnable. Shamash-Shum-Ukin was counting on a protracted defense and the aid of his allies, but no help came. The Assyrian generals defeated their allies one by one. The Elamites were driven back. The Chaldeans were routed. The Arab tribes were scattered in the desert. Babylon was left alone to face its fate and the wrath of Ashurbanipal. The siege lasted almost 3 years. 3 years of hell on earth. The Assyrians blocked all the canals, all the roads. The city, accustomed to abundance, began to slowly die of starvation. First, all the animals were eaten, then the rats and the sandal leather. The air of Babylon, once filled with the aroma of incense and blooming gardens, thickened with the stench of death. The markets where grain and spices from all over the world had once been traded were deserted. Only desiccated bodies lay on their flagstones. Blood-curdling evidence survives. Driven to the brink of despair, the inhabitants of Babylon began to eat each other. Tablets dispassionately report that the price of human flesh became known to all. Mothers closed their doors to shut out the cries of their starving children. Fathers looked at their sons not with love, but with the despair of a predator. The greatness of Babylon was devoured from within. In 648 BCE, the agony ended. Assyrian soldiers, intoxicated with rage and anticipation of plunder, broke into the doomed city. The slaughter began. They killed everyone indiscriminately, warriors and civilians, men and women. The streets where Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar once walked turned into rivers of blood. And what of Shamash Shamukin? He saw that all was lost. Captivity did not mean a quick death. It meant humiliation, torture, ritual execution before the eyes of the jubilant Nineveh crowd. Ashurbanipal would not spare his own brother. And then the king of Babylon made his final choice. He gathered his family, his most trusted confidants, his treasures, locked himself in the royal palace, and set it ablaze. He chose not chains, but a funeral pyre. He chose the purifying flame over shame. The king of Babylon became his own flame, turning his palace into a grand tomb. Ashurbanipal was victorious. He performed a rite of purification for the city, appointed a new puppet king, and unleashed his wrath on all who had supported the rebellion. The tongues of the instigators were torn out. Their bodies were thrown to dogs and hyenas. It seemed Assyria's power was firmly established, but this victory was Pyrrhic. The great rebellion bled the empire dry. The finest legions perished beneath the walls of Babylon. The treasury was devastated by the years-long war. Hatred of Assyria in the conquered lands reached boiling point. Nineveh celebrated its triumph, oblivious to the deepening cracks in the empire's foundations. The fire that engulfed Shamash Shamukin's palace in Babylon was merely a harbinger of the all-consuming blaze that, just a few decades later, would reduce Nineveh itself to ashes. 612 BCE. The air around Nineveh is thick and heavy. It smells of dust, fear, and the smoke of thousands of siege fires. Within walls thick enough for 3 chariots abreast lies the heart of the most fearsome empire the world has ever seen. Nineveh, den of lions, city of blood, so called by its enemies and so called by the prophets, and now its enemies stand at its gates. This was no ordinary rebellion. An alliance had gathered at the walls of the world's greatest city, forged not by gold but by a centuries-old thirst for vengeance. From the east came the Medes of King Cyaxares, mountain warriors whose ancestors the Assyrians had flayed alive. From the south came the Babylonians, led by Nabopolassar, a cunning and patient strategist who had once been viceroy of Assyria and was now leading his people to freedom. Tens of thousands of warriors, speaking different languages, but united by a single goal, to rip the fangs from the Assyrian lion. The siege lasted 3 long, grueling months. Nineveh laughed at its enemies. Its walls seemed eternal. Its granaries groaned with grain enough to feed the city for years. Its defenders, descendants of the great warriors Ashurbanipal and Sennacherib, rained down clouds of arrows on the besiegers from the heights of their Cyclopean towers. It seemed the city, which had conquered the world from Egypt to Elam, would stand firm this time too. The Assyrian king Sinshar-Ishkun gazed from the walls of his palace upon the impotent fury of his enemies, confident in the divine protection of Ashur and the invincibility of his capital. But the Assyrian gods remained silent, and nature decided to intervene. That spring was unusually rainy. The Tigris River, Nineveh's nurse and protector, which for centuries had filled its moats and watered its gardens, rebelled. The water rose to unprecedented heights. Muddy, roaring streams pounded the foundations of the adobe walls with a fury no battering ram could match, and the wall gave way. Not iron, but water had gnawed a breach in the defenses of the eternal city. A huge section of the outer wall, eroded at its base, collapsed with a deafening roar into the boiling river. At that moment, the fate of Nineveh was decided. Through the breach, mixed with mud and river water, poured the combined armies, Babylonians, Medes, Scythian mercenaries, all who had cherished hatred for generations. The agony began. Streets designed for triumphal processions turned into narrow slaughterhouses. Slaughter took place in every house, in every temple. This was not a battle for the city, but its extermination. The prophecies were fulfilled with terrifying accuracy. Chariots rampaged through the squares, whips whistled in the air, and mountains of corpses barred the victor's path. The soldiers took revenge for everything, for the burned cities of their fathers, for the stolen cattle, for the humiliation of their gods, for the impalement of their brothers. Assyrian cruelty, which had been an instrument of their power, now turned against them. No one was spared, not the elderly, not women, not children. The city of blood drowned in its own blood, and then came the fire. Great palaces were ablaze. Sennacherib's palace, a palace without equal, with its gardens and reliefs glorifying victories, was transformed into a gigantic funeral pyre. The fire consumed carved panels of Lebanese cedar, melted gold jewelry, and reduced priceless textiles and ivory to ash. In the southern part of the city, Ashurbanipal's palace burned, and with it, his greatest treasure: thousands of clay tablets. All the wisdom and history of Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, laws, astronomical observations, royal chronicles, magical spells. The greatest library of the ancient world was destroyed by fire. But here, fate took its most incredible turn. Fire, which destroyed papyrus and parchment in other cultures, became a preservative for clay. The flames, intended to erase the memory of Assyria, scorched the cuneiform tablets, transforming the fragile clay into durable ceramic. The fire that destroyed an empire forever preserved its voice for posterity. The fate of the last king, Sinshar-Ishkun, remained a mystery, consumed by chaos. Most likely, like his predecessors, he refused to endure the shame and perished in the fire of his own palace, the final sacrifice on the altar of Assyrian greatness. When the smoke cleared, Nineveh lay in smoldering ruins. The city, whose very name had made kings from the Nile to the Caucasus tremble for 3 centuries, had ceased to exist. The victors carried off everything that hadn't burned and departed, leaving the ashes to be devoured by jackals. An empire built on iron, fire, and fear collapsed not in decades, but in a matter of days. Its heart was torn out. Its capital was razed to the ground so thoroughly that just 2 centuries later, the Greek historian Xenophon, marching past these grassy hills with his army of 10,000, didn't even realize that beneath his feet lay the ruins of the capital of the world. Silence fell, a deafening absolute silence after centuries of the triumphant roar of the Assyrian war machine. The world breathed a sigh of relief. But the void left by the hegemon was already beckoning new empires, ready to take its place. History abhors a vacuum. In 612 BCE, the last crimson sun rose over Nineveh. The air, once ringing with the clash of weapons and the commands of thousands of warriors, was now thick and heavy with smoke. The city once called the heart of the world, whose pulse reverberated from Egypt to the Iranian mountains, was dying in agony. An empire forged in fire perished in flames. Median horsemen and Babylonian spearmen knew no mercy. They were avenging centuries of fear, burned cities, exiled peoples, flayed kings. Palaces whose walls told of endless victories collapsed, burying reliefs depicting scenes of triumph. The great library of King Ashurbanipal, a repository of wisdom and curses, burst into flames, and the fire intended to destroy paradoxically preserved the knowledge, turning the fragile clay of the tablets into eternal stone. And then there was silence. 2,000 years of near-total oblivion. The name of Assyria lived only on the pages of the Bible, synonymous with cruelty and divine wrath. Its cities became nameless hills, Teli, where shepherds wandered, unaware that the capitals of the world slept beneath their feet. The great Greek general Xenophon, in the 4th century BC, led 10,000 of his warriors past the ruins of Nineveh and didn't even understand what they were. He saw only gigantic eroded hills by the Tigris River. The empire didn't simply fall, it was erased, deleted from human memory as thoroughly as its own scribes crossed out the names of vanquished gods. The victors rewrote history, leaving behind only the image of a bloody monster. But the clay remembers. The stone waits. In the mid-19th century, people with a different outlook arrived in Mesopotamia. European diplomats and adventurers, driven by a thirst for glory and biblical prophecies. The Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta began digging at Khorsabad Hill, and one day his workers screamed. The shovel struck more than mere stone. From beneath the earth, after 2.5 millennia of darkness, the eyes of a winged Shedu bull, the colossal guardian of Sargon II's palace, peered out at them. The world gasped. These were not myths. These were not the tales of ancient texts. Assyria was real. Following Botta came the Briton Austen Henry Layard. He dug at Nimrud Hill and then at Nineveh, and from beneath the centuries-old dust palaces rose again. Halls decorated with alabaster panels depicted Assyrian kings hunting lions, besieging cities, and leading captives to execution. The story told by the Assyrians themselves was even more brutal and majestic than their enemies had imagined. But the greatest treasure wasn't found in stone. When Layard's men excavated the halls of the palace in Nineveh, they found neither gold nor jewels. They found thousands upon thousands of broken clay tablets, the very same ones that had survived the fires of 612. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, 25,000 fragments of cuneiform texts, and when scholars like Henry Rawlinson cracked the code of ancient writing, the ghosts of Assyria spoke. Their voice shook the world. Yes, they spoke of war, tribute, and executions, but they spoke of other things too. They told us the story of Gilgamesh seeking immortality. They left us medical treatises, astronomical diaries where they tracked the movements of the planets with frightening precision. They preserved laws, dictionaries, school exercises, letters from merchants, and even complaints about noisy neighbors. What we saw was not just a killing machine, but a highly complex civilization. A civilization of bureaucrats, scientists, engineers, and poets. Ashurbanipal, whom we knew as a ruthless conqueror, also emerged as an intellectual king, proud of his ability to read complex texts and solve mathematical problems. How can these two images be reconciled? The image of a library builder and the image of a man who boasted of mountains of severed heads? This paradox lies the true legacy of Assyria. It created the first prototype of a true empire in history. Not just a conglomerate of captured cities, but a single organism linked by a network of roads governed from a single center, with a unified system of governance and an army that became a model for all subsequent conquerors. The Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans, all consciously or not, learned from the Assyrians. They adopted the idea of provinces governed by governors. They understood the effectiveness of psychological warfare when rumors of your cruelty travel ahead of the army, and cities surrender without a fight. Assyria wrote a bloody but effective textbook on creating and maintaining an empire. But Assyria's legacy is more than just stones and clay buried in the desert. It lives on. It resides in its people. Modern Assyrians, a Christian people who speak dialects of Aramaic, the very language that became the lingua franca of the late Assyrian Empire, consider themselves direct descendants of this ancient civilization. For them, Ashur and Nineveh are more than just archaeological sites. They are their lost homeland, a part of their identity, which they cling to through centuries of persecution. Their story is a tragic echo of their ancestors, a story of survival against all odds. And so, in the 21st century, the world watched in horror as the shadows of the past came to life in the most monstrous way. Fanatics who had proclaimed a new caliphate on the same lands turned sledgehammers and bulldozers on the winged bulls of Nimrod and the walls of Nineveh. They blew up what time had spared. It was as if Assyria's ancient enemies had risen from the ashes to finish what they had begun and erase even the memory of the empire. This act of vandalism was a bitter reminder that the struggle for the past never ends. So, what remains of Assyria? Ruins that could still be destroyed, tablets that still pose uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and civilization. The idea of empire remains, effective, ruthless, and all-encompassing, and a people who bear this ancient name through the storms of modern history. The empire has crumbled to dust, but from these dust, through the millennia, whispers reach us. Whispers of power, of knowledge, of cruelty, and of the fragility of everything that seems eternal. We can only listen